This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 643 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. A few weeks ago, I put an old episode of the show in the podcast feed on the running back dead zone. Last week, I talked about ambiguous backfields. There was one specific thing that those two episodes told us about the running back position in fantasy football. And it was that you generally want to avoid running backs with average draft positions in the 4th, 5th, and maybe 6th round of your fantasy drafts. But I think fantasy managers sometimes take advice like this way too far. When I say to avoid running backs in those rounds, I just mean generally. Fantasy football is a probability-driven game. My analysis, the things that I say, none of it's for certain. Nothing I say when I'm predicting things is 100% right. But the studies that I do can help us increase our probability of being right more than our league mates. The truth is, I actually don't think that the running back dead zone is an area of your fantasy draft that you need to avoid at all costs. I do think that you should avoid being overweight with running backs from that area of the draft. But if you're playing in multiple leagues, or if you're doing best ball drafts, or if you're just stuck in your draft and don't know what to do, you can draft a running back from the dead zone. It's going to be okay. Because at the end of the day, not all running backs in the dead zone end up busting. There have been plenty of them who have succeeded through the years. And there may be ways to spot the ones that you should be drafting. Now, before getting any further, remember that with the NBA Finals here, you can make every game feel like Game 7 on FanDuel Sportsbook, an official partner of the NBA. Throughout the playoffs, all customers can place a no-sweat same-game parlay each week. You'll get up to $20 in free bets if you don't win. FanDuel has so many ways to play, and best of all, when you do win, you'll get paid faster than a fast break. Either way, you'll get up to $20 in free bets if your same-game parlay during the playoffs doesn't win. So go place a no-sweat same-game parlay today with FanDuel Sportsbook. Let's first establish why the running back dead zone is a thing, and why fantasy analysts like myself love to talk about it. If you look at historical hit rates by average draft position or ADP, it's not pretty for running backs in that area of fantasy drafts, in that round 4-ish through round 5-ish and maybe round 6-ish range. To help you understand this, let me walk through a quick math exercise. I looked at my fantasy league's redraft average draft position data since 2011, and I split running backs up into 6 pick groups. The first group being running backs who had ADPs between 1 and 6. The second being a group with running backs drafted between picks 6 and 12, and so on. Really, what these little groups represent is front half and back half running backs in each round. So front half round 1 running backs and back half round 1 running backs. Front half round 2 running backs and back half round 2 running backs. That's all based on a 12-team league. I created these groups all the way through round 9. And my goal was to see what percentage of the running backs in each group ended up hitting different points per game thresholds. And the running backs that I'm analyzing today, for the record, played at least 8 games. So for instance, let's just look at that first group, or running backs who are drafted between picks 1 and 6 on average. So the first 6 picks in a draft overall. These are the elite of the elites. These are the Christian McCaffreys and Jonathan Taylors of the world. All but one of them hit 12 PPR points per game. 86% of them hit 14 PPR points per game. 71% of them hit 16 points per game, and 46% of them hit 18 points per game. I did that same exact exercise for every group in every round through round 9. What becomes clear when you chart this out is that hit rates start to decline a bit when you enter the back half of round 3. Back half of round 3 running backs, just 32% of them historically have hit 14 or more PPR points per game in a given season. For some context, back half round 2 running backs hit that at a 70% rate. Not only that, but ceilings start to evaporate around that point in drafts as well. Back half of round 3 running backs hit 16 or more PPR points per game at a 16% rate. That was far lower than the subsets that came before them. And as you moved into round 4 and round 5, those hit rates were still pretty low. The 16 or more PPR points per game threshold, none of those groups had more than 21% of running backs hitting that mark. They were usually hovering in the mid-teens. Now, maybe you can't totally visualize this. I wouldn't blame you. It's hard to follow this kind of stuff on a podcast. So let me just give it to you straight. What this data really shows is that running backs drafted at the end of round 3 are not a whole lot different than running backs who were drafted in round 7. Yes, round 7 when paying attention only to ceiling. For example, a front half round 7 running back has hit 16 or more PPR points per game at about a 17% clip. That number is 18% when looking at the back half of round 7. Those numbers are higher than back half round 4 running backs, back half round 5 running backs, and all of round 6. And they're comparable to the other sections of the dead zone. Round 3 and 4 running backs in particular, though, have provided better floors. They're better at hitting 12 or 14 PPR points per game. But that's part of the problem with the running backs who get selected in the dead zone. They're typically elevated based on need, not ability. Managers panic when they don't have an early round running back or two, and they reach for these players who don't have complete profiles. Instead, they really should just be opting for wide receivers who hit at a much better rate in those rounds. The running backs that they're reaching for, they don't have high enough ceilings. These running backs can give you a floor, but they often aren't giving you great league-winning upside. They're not outperforming round 7 players at a super high rate when you focus on ceiling. That flat scoring distribution then devalues the position. You already knew all of this, though. You knew that the running back dead zone existed. This is just another way of showing it. But here's the thing. Good running backs still come from the dead zone. Those percentages that I threw out there, yes, they're low. Yes, round 7 running backs have shown similar ceilings. But there have been hits. Good, productive running backs have still emerged from the dead zone. So I decided to see if there were any traits that those successful dead zone running backs shared. And naturally, since I'm doing this episode, there were. Going back to the ADP data, since 2011, 127 running backs have played 8 or more games and have been drafted between the back half of round 3 and through round 6. So pick 30 to pick 72 in a 12-team league. We'll call this the dead zone, since that's where hit rates seem to really flatten. Of those 127 running backs, 18 of them were able to hit 16 or more PPR points per game in a season. 16 is arbitrary. It's an arbitrary number. But 16 does represent a running back who would have been right there at RB10 last year. And over the last couple of seasons, I've found that top 10 running backs were generally the ones that you should care about in fantasy football because they were the ones who were giving you a more dramatic edge. They were your league winners. But yeah, it's arbitrary. With something like this, you've got to be a little subjective though. So 18 running backs have truly emerged from the dead zone over the last 11 years. What do we know about these running backs? Let's start with the thing that I always start with, and that's receiving. As a lot of you know, I've done studies on spotting breakout running backs in the past. And one of the things that's obvious is that breakout running backs tend to be good receivers. They tend to see a disproportionate amount of targets compared to rushes. That's no different with these dead zone running backs. Of the 18 successful dead zone running backs, their average rush attempts to targets rate was about 4.7. So I'm just looking at total rush attempts divided by total targets, and that's your rate. It was 4.7. When looking at the 109 running backs who did not emerge from the dead zone, that number was 5.7. In other words, these successful running backs are seeing targets at a higher rate than the unsuccessful ones. Not only that, but that 4.7 number, it's being skewed by Derrick Henry's 2019 campaign. When you remove him from the sample, that 4.7 actually falls to 4.2, significantly lower than the players who have failed to emerge out of the dead zone. Successful dead zone running backs had a target share average of 10.2%. That was over 3 percentage points higher than the other group. I don't think this is all that surprising given number 1, we know receiving matters for running backs. Number 2, I'm analyzing PPR scoring. And number 3, this exact same trend popped up in other studies that I've done. It doesn't do you much good to draft running backs who won't catch passes. Another thing that I wanted to check and see was the offenses that these running backs played in. Of the successful running backs out of the dead zone, their offenses averaged 2.7 touchdowns per game. Of the unsuccessful ones, that number was 2.3. So you could maybe make the argument that offensive performance helps. We also have hindsight to help us see something like this, so it may not be as actionable. But sure, all things being equal, Pick a running back who's in an offense that's likely going to score. And then there's one other piece of information I think is useful when trying to find running backs in the dead zone who could be successful. Age. Of these running backs who have been drafted in the dead zone since 2011, we've seen a wide variety of ages. We've had 21 rookies, 16 second-year players, 24 third-year players. We've even had an 11th-year player in Frank Gore. But there's a definite separation when looking at age. The successful dead zone running backs, they were in, on average, their 3.2nd year in the league. In other words, the average successful dead zone running back was basically in year 3. That number was almost a year and a half older for the unsuccessful group. And now get this. The absolute best running back subset, the one that's hit at the highest rate through the years out of the running back dead zone, it's rookies. Almost 29% of rookie running backs drafted in the dead zone ended up emerging, or scoring 16 or more PPR points per game. That's about 10 percentage points higher than any other age group. And the second best age group is year 2 players, who hit at about a 19% rate. Rookies made up 1/3 of the running back dead zone hits since 2011. Rookies in year 2 players made up half of the hits. So quite simply, you want young running backs who can catch passes and who are ideally in good offenses. And I think this makes plenty of sense intuitively. Those types of running backs are likely getting drafted in the dead zone, not because of a fantasy manager's need and a demand for the position, but because fantasy managers are concerned about the ambiguity that they bring, because they're not experienced players. We don't know how good they are, but they're likely talented. Rather than boosting an untalented, one-dimensional running back into the dead zone, you should be striving for players who offer a sincere ceiling with their talent. You should buy into that variance. You should buy into that ambiguity. It's not a guarantee that the player will hit. In fact, you should still do your best to stay away from the dead zone. But it's definitely a way to get some exposure to that area of the draft. And it's a way to navigate out of that area if you're really stuck in a draft. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'll talk to you later in the week with the Mailbag Show.